Hi guys, and welcome to the Is It Worth It for the Type 62, the Tier 7 Chinese Premium Light Tank. It is not available from the gift shop, and it is not available from the tech tree. It does on occasion appear in the gift shop on very special occasions, but it doesn't happen very often, and consequently, it's one of the rarest tanks in the game. You do not see very many Type 62s on the battlefield. And the question we're going to be asking today is the Type 62 worth it? Now, if you're a regular visitor to my channel, then you'll realize that I'm currently in the middle of reviewing all the Tier 5 premium tanks, so why am I suddenly reviewing a Tier 7 premium tank? Well, the answer is that next month, September 2014, depending on when you're watching this, the Type 62 is going to be available as an award for completing September missions. So you will be able to get your hands on this very rare tank by completing monthly missions. Now, I'm not going to kid you, the missions are tough and it's going to take a lot of work, but if you really do want a Type 62 in your garage, it is possible to get one for free next month. So I wanted to get the review out before the missions began. Now, as per usual, we're going to start with the history of the tank, and the Type 62 has a very long history, so I'll try and keep this as short as I can. This was a tank that was first designed and developed in 1957 or 1958, depending on what source you read, and went into mass production around 1960. So it is quite a modern tank, and it is so modern that the Type 62 is still in production today. The Type 62 is still used by the Chinese PLA today. Most recently, Type 62s were seen acting as reconnaissance tanks for PLA artillery divisions in 2013. So the Type 62 has been around for a long time and is still in use in various configurations. So if you're thinking that this is a very rare tank but it looks very familiar, well, there's a couple of reasons for that. And the first one is this was designed as a light variation on the Type 59. So you've probably seen plenty of Type 59s in game. This looks very similar, and it's basically a lighter version of the Type 59. The Type 62 has been in conflict. Again, it was developed a lot later than a lot of the tanks in the game, but it has been in conflict. It was involved in the Vietnam War in the 1960s and early 1970s. It was also involved in the Indochina War in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Unfortunately, it didn't perform very well because even though the terrain was suited to it, it is a light tank. It is very lightly armored, and even infantrymen carrying RPGs were a threat to it. Let's head into the tech tree and we'll take a look at the Chinese light tanks. Now, they do have a light tank at Tier 4, the M5A1 Stuart, but the first tanks that were actually developed in China begin with the 5916. Now, I did say that the Type 62 was a light tank variant of the Type 59, but it all began with the 5916. That is why the 5916 is called 5916. It's because this was the prototype. This tank was never mass produced. It was simply the prototype, turning the Type 59 into a lighter tank. So the 5916 fits in here at Tier 6. Now, the Type 62 used to be a Tier 6, but it was changed to Tier 7 with the introduction of the Chinese tech tree. And the reason it was changed to Tier 7 is because we have a WZ-131 sitting here at Tier 7 and a WZ-132 sitting here at Tier 8. And another reason that basically the Type 62 may look familiar is that the WZ-131 and the WZ-132 are exactly the same tanks. So a lot of what was special and unique about the Type 62 disappeared with the introduction of the Chinese tech tree. As I say, to be honest, I'm going to be a little bit critical of wargaming here, and I am very disappointed. I'm still disappointed over the fact that the WZ-131 and the Type 62 are basically a cut and paste job. The two tanks are identical. They use the same model, they use the same stats, they use the same equipment. It's the same tank, and it really took away from the uniqueness of the Type 62. As I say, I've been driving this tank a long time before Chinese tanks were introduced. I thought it was a fantastic tank, but really, if you do want to experience driving a Type 62, you really just need to grind up to the WZ-131 because it is exactly the same tank. Now I'm going to be using Tank Compare for this because you're going to see basically how similar these two tanks are. They use the same models, they use the same icons, everything is the same about these two tanks. And as I say, the Type 62 used to be a Tier 6 and it was moved up to Tier 7 simply because it's a WZ-131 and the WZ-131 was a Tier 7. So we'll take a look here and we can see that it's not quite a stock WZ-131. I've said it in previous videos that it was basically a stock 131 with a better gun. That's not quite true because the suspension has been upgraded, the turret has been upgraded. So basically it is a half stock WZ-131. It's using the upgraded suspension and the upgraded turret from the WZ-131. The radio is the stock radio and the engine is the stock engine, but the turret and tracks have both been upgraded. However, the WZ-131 gets a large selection of guns, and the third gun, the 85mm 6285T, is the gun that is used on the Type 62. So we're going to install that on the WZ-131, and we're going to very quickly roll down here, and we can see the tiers are the same, the battle tiers are the same, the hit points are the same, signal range is the same, speed limit's the same, reverse speed is the same, they weigh the same, the load limit's the same, the crew layout's the same, armor profile on hull and turret is the same, engine power, horsepower to weight ratio, traverse speed, climb angle, terrain resistance, fire chance, view range, turret traverse. It's all the same. It's the same tank. If we take a look at the guns, we've got the same penetration, the same alpha damage, the same DPM, same rate of fire, same reload, same accuracy, same aim time, same gun depression of 5 degrees, same amount of ammo. The camo values are identical. It's exactly the same tank. If you want to experience driving a Type 62, simply go and get yourself a WZ-131 and use this configuration because it's the same bloody tank. So in my reviews, I like to compare premium tanks to their competitors. The problem is that there aren't any other Tier 7 light tank premiums, and therefore I can't compare it against any of the other Tier 7 light tank premiums. What I can do is I can compare it against something like the T-71. That's the only Tier 7 light tank I have in my garage. Now, I did own the WZ-131, but I sold it after finishing with it because... not because it was a bad tank. I really enjoyed the WZ-131, but the reason I sold it was because I had a Type 62, and there is absolutely no point in keeping a WZ-131 when it's the same tank as a premium tank I already owned. Even the WZ-132, which is a pretty good tank, is the same tank. It's slightly better in some ways, but it's basically the same tank as a Type 62, and I don't even know if I'm going to keep the WZ-132 when I'm done with it because it's just so similar to the Type 62. However, I do have a T-71 in my garage, so what I could do is I could compare it to the T-71, and while I don't own the AMX 1375 anymore, but that would be another perfect tank to compare it against. I have compared all of these tanks in Tank Compare, and basically what we can see here is the hit points are favorable, the weight is a little bit heavier, but the engine power is better. The speed limit is very similar to the T-71 and to the AMX 1375. The traverse speed again is very similar. The armor on the T-71, Type 62 and AMX 1375 is all very similar. The rate of fire again is very similar, even though the AMX 1375 and the T-71 are autoloaders. The view range is very similar across all three tanks. The AMX 1375 gets 390 meters of view range, just like the Type 62. T-71 is slightly better at 400 meters. The turret traverse speed on basically all the tanks is very similar, and the only place where the Type 62 falls down against the fully upgraded Tier 7 light tanks in game is its signal range. It only has 300 or 600 meters of signal range, whereas basically the T-71, AMX 1375, and the WZ-131 get much better signal range when they are fully upgraded. But basically, what I'm saying is the Type 62, even though it is not a fully upgraded WZ-131, it is still very competitive against a WZ-131, and it is very, very competitive against any of the other Tier 7 light tanks in the game, even though it's a premium tank. So it really doesn't fall down. You will be able to compete in a Type 62 as well as you could in any other Tier 7 light tank. Other than the signal range, the other weakness the Type 62 has towards any of the other light tanks, with the exception of the WZ-131, because again, it's the same tank, is its gun depression. The Type 62 only has 5 degrees of gun depression, which is significantly worse than a lot of other scouts. T-71 has 7 degrees of gun depression, and the AMX 1375 has 6 degrees, so the gun depression can get you into trouble now and again. So in this little clip, I have just spotted an AMX-13 in the middle in Abbey, and I'm moving up to the corner, and I see that he's about to poke. So I think, okay, I'm going to pop out, get a quick shot into him, and there we go. The 5 degrees of gun depression really do hurt you sometimes. Fair play to the enemy AMX-1390 who was able to turn around and get a shot into me so quickly, but gun depression is something you need to be aware of on this tank. If I'd been in a T-71, if I'd been in a Chaffee or a lot of other scouts, I would have been able to shoot him when he decided to pop out of the archway, but I couldn't do that in a Type 62. So let's talk about this gun. I really do like this gun, even though it is not the final gun on a WZ-131, and there are 2 guns that are higher tier than it. It is still a very good gun. Something I forgot to show you when we were in Tank Compare is that even when you have a fully upgraded WZ-131 with the final gun, yes, it'll give you more penetration, it'll give you more alpha damage, but the final guns on the WZ-131 actually drop in DPM by a significant margin. So you're sacrificing DPM for penetration and alpha damage on the later guns. But the 85mm that's on the Type 62 is actually a very good gun. It has a really good rate of fire. This tank will put out shots very quickly. It has 145mm of penetration. Now that may not seem much when you compare it to the final gun on the WZ-131, which gets up to 180mm of penetration, or even the gun on the T-71, which gets 175mm of penetration. But 145mm of penetration is actually fine. The AMX 1375 only gets 144mm of penetration, so the gun works just fine. The trick with the WZ-131 is, like most scouts, don't engage other tanks frontally, try and get side shots, try and flank them, try and get rear shots, and 145mm of penetration is just fine. 180 alpha damage could be better, but again, you've got a very fast rate of fire, so that 180 alpha damage builds up very quickly, and this tank has very good DPM. In fact, it's very close to 2000 DPM. Its accuracy is 0.37, which on paper does not look that great, but it is actually pretty good, as you're going to be seeing in some clips later. The accuracy on this gun is surprisingly good, even at distance. The aim time, again, on paper is very average. It's not bad, it's not great, but 2.3 aiming time is perfect for this gun. It works really well. So I really do enjoy the gun on the Type 62, even though on paper it may not have the best penetration. The way you need to play this tank means that the penetration doesn't really matter that much. However, there are problems, and the problems begin with the premium ammunition. The premium ammunition has 220mm of penetration. Now that's not bad. 220 looks okay, but this tank has suffered a nerf. Around 8.8, premium ammo was nerfed on Chinese tanks, and I believe it went from around 250mm of penetration down to 220. But that didn't bother me too much because 220mm of penetration is still pretty good. And you do need to use premium ammunition on a Type 62 because the matchmaking is very, very heavily weighted against the Type 62. In fact, matchmaking for the Type 62 goes all the way up to Tier 11. Yes, I know Tier 11 doesn't exist in the game, but what that means is you are far more likely to get a Type 62 into a Tier 10 game than you are with a lot of other scouts. So you do see a lot of Tier 10s, you do see a lot of Tier 9s in a Type 62, and 145mm of penetration on a standard AP really isn't good enough when you're up against Tier 9s and 10s. For example, you're not going to go through the side of a E75 at distance, and even if you're up close and personal, you're not going to be going through even the sides or rear of tanks like, for example, the Maus or E100s. So really, the premium ammo is needed due to the matchmaking, and 220 is okay for penetration. However, the major issue I have is not only was the penetration on the premium ammo nerfed, but something that makes me absolutely rage. And we're going to go in and I'm just going to have a little bit of a rage about this particular tank and the premium ammunition. As you can see, the premium ammunition is bloody expensive. 4,800 credits or 12 gold for premium ammunition on a Type 62. This is a tank that only has 180 alpha damage. Now, it may not seem like much, but I'm going to put this into perspective. So I'm going to come out, let's get rid of all of this. I want to look at premium tanks, and we'll take a look at, for example, a Tier 8 premium like the IS-6. Now, let's take a look at the premium ammo for an IS-6. A T-62 only has 180 alpha damage, and IS-6 has 350 average alpha damage. But look, the cost of the ammo is exactly the same, 4,800 credits or 12 gold. That is absolutely insane. The Type 62 is a Tier 7 premium tank. It has a much lower caliber weapon, it does far less alpha damage, but yet it costs as much to fire premium ammo in the Type 62 as it does to fire premium ammo in the IS-6. Now the major difference is that an IS-6 sometimes has to fire premium ammo, but it will only see up to Tier 9s, and it doesn't have to fire premium ammo as often as perhaps a Type 62 does, because the Type 62 will see Tier 10s even though it's at Tier 7. The major problem I have is that when you hit and penetrate with a premium shell on an IS-6, you will make the cost of that shell back in credits. When you're doing 350 alpha damage every time you fire a premium shot, you will basically make your credits back. In fact, you may even make some profit by firing premium in an IS-6, providing it actually penetrates. It's a different story with the Type 62 because the ammo costs exactly the same. However, the alpha damage is that much lower, and when you fire premium in the Type 62, even if you penetrate and do full damage with a premium shell, it is very unlikely it is going to make you any credits. However, unlike a lot of Tier 8 premium tanks, you're actually going to be shooting at tanks that are more heavily armored than the Tier 8 premium tanks have to face. It doesn't make any sense to me why Wargaming raised the price, because the cost of the premium shells on the Type 62 used to be a lot lower. It was basically half this price, and in those situations where you did have to fire premium ammo, you could actually still turn a profit. But now, if you're going to be spamming gold in this tank, you are going to lose money. So you really need to be careful if you want to make money in the Type 62. You'll make money if you get it into a Tier 8 game because you don't have to fire a lot of premium, but you're going to probably lose money in a tier 9 or 10 game if you do have to fire a lot of gold. Again, there are tanks you will be able to penetrate without using premium at tier 9 and tier 10, but the fact is you're going to be facing higher tier tanks than a lot of tier 8 premium tanks do. You're going to be paying as much as they do for your premium ammo. You're going to be doing far less alpha damage with that premium ammo, and you are going to be making a loss, so just be very careful. Okay guys, let's see this engine and this gun in action. We are here on Hidden Village. It's a 50-50 game, tier 8 game, so nice matchup for the Type 62. Normally, as I've said before, you will usually end up getting into a tier 8 or tier 9 or tier 10 game, so once again a tier 8 game is a nice matchup for this tank. You can see I've already accelerated up to 60 kilometers an hour. This tank does accelerate really quickly, even though it's using the WZ-131 stock engine. Acceleration is great on this tank, and I am going to, as I normally do in my Type 62, advance into a position where I'm going to get some early spots. Maybe spot what's heading into town, and we've spotted a Churchill. So M4E2 is spotted, Jagdtiger 88 is spotted, so I'm getting my early spots off. Players are putting shots in already. I decide to go for a shot and fall back because that M4A3E2 was advancing, and I thought he was going to spot me, but it turns out he didn't spot me. It's not until he gets to within 50 meters, so camo rating when firing this gun is actually pretty good. Again, looking for shots on this Churchill. Oh, and another Centurion is over there. So a Centurion sneaked across without me seeing him. But you can see that the accuracy on the gun is good enough to be able to get a shot in at distance on that Centurion. And small gap between the houses, and I don't pen, I end up hitting the top of his turret and bouncing, but I actually hit him. So accuracy is something I actually really do like about this tank. Time that shot well, get another shot into the Centurion. And again, I'm trying to find shots through the houses, but it's just not working. So our T-21 has been really aggressive, has advanced into enemy spawn, so I know that RT isn't going to be focused here anymore. So now I decide to make my move. Now, this Hidden Village is not a map I like very much. And the reason is he looks to be a stock Centurion actually, so we go for a nice shot, track him in place. That finally gets me spotted, but a T-21 is in their cap. Su-152 is falling down, or is reversing down the slope. So we hang around, get a nice shot into his side. And we're just going to work here. So the gun is performing really well, but it usually does. And the 145 millimeters of penetration is fine, absolutely fine, if you're managing to get side and rear shots on enemy tanks. It is lacking when you go head-to-head, but you really, if you're going head-to-head in a Type 62, you're doing it wrong. So I've sneaked up behind this Jagdtiger 88. There's a T-29 reversing back down, so I set the Jagdtiger on fire. He uses a premium fire extinguisher, but I'm just trying to work on this Jagdtiger 88 without getting hit by that T-29. Unfortunately, he does manage to sneak a shell in. Someone else sets the Jagdtiger on fire, and I nick the kill. Yes, that was me nicking the kill, but I want kills in this tank. So I've taken a hit from the T-29, and he's advanced to a point where he could possibly hit me again. You can see the reverse speed on this tank is also very good. So I decide, you know what, I'm not going to go head-to-head against those tanks, and I'm going to be doing some maneuvering, I'm going to be doing some flanking. So our Comet and our Panther II have advanced all the way around the enemy tanks. I decide to go and join them. Now, I basically stopped scouting. About 3 minutes into this game, I stopped scouting. I've gone into damage dealing mode. You really got to ask yourself, and this is a problem not just for the Type 62, but for all light tanks. That's the way more and more games are turning out, and you know, do you really have to be in a light tank to be able to do this? So VK3001H in the background. I mean, anything I did in this game, I would have been able to do in a medium tank. So I really sometimes ask myself, really, what is the role of the light tank in World of Tanks these days? So I killed a VK, I'm going for a shot in that T-29, but unfortunately I'm not in time. So let's pop down here, see if we can get some shots on these guys. Oh, got shot by the Comet. So take out the IS-6, almost reloaded, get a shot into the front of the T-34, and someone else takes him out. So there's 2,468 damage with 4 kills, but like I say, I've got to ask myself after a game like that, that was a really, really good game, but could I have done that in a medium tank? And the answer would be yes. I mean, I didn't do anything there that a medium tank isn't capable of. And that really comes down to the modern map design that Wargaming have decided to use. A lot of these maps are scout unfriendly, and you end up having to play your scouts pretty much like aggressive medium tanks. So that was a first class badge. I finished top on XP with 1240 XP and 2,468 damage with 4 kills. These days, more and more of my games on the Type 62 are playing it like a fast, maneuverable medium tank, flanking and shooting enemy tanks on the side and rear. So let's talk about the crew. Well, it's got a very, very nice crew configuration. As you can see, I'm using the WZ-132 crew in here because once you get past Tier 4, basically all the Chinese light tanks have the same crew configuration. Only a commander, gunner, driver, and loader. So that works all the way up to the WZ-132, and essentially the WZ-131, the WZ-132, and the 5916. The 5916 was the prototype for the Type 62, and these two tanks are the same as the Type 62, although the WZ-132 is a slightly more modern version of it, and it has slightly more armor, but again, as a light tank, that doesn't mean much. But the crew configuration for the later Chinese tanks is very, very good. It doesn't match, unfortunately, the lower tier tanks because you need a radio operator, but for the later Chinese light tanks it is very, very good. So let's talk about equipment, and there are a lot of equipment choices for the Type 62. Starting at the top, vertical stabilizers. Well, the Type 62, even though it's a hidden stat, is actually quite good at firing on the move, and vertical stabilizers would actually make that better. The thing with light tanks is it's all down to your playstyle. The Type 62 can be played like a lightly armored medium, it can be played like a pure scout, and there are a lot of viable equipment choices, again, depending on how you want to play it. I don't use vert stabs, but as I say, the accuracy when firing this gun on the move is actually quite good on the tank already, and vertical stabilizers are actually a reasonable choice for this tank if you choose to play it a lot like a very, very fast maneuverable medium. It will make the gun even better than it is when firing on the move. Toolbox, again, not a bad choice if you've got a spare equipment slot and a spare toolbox. Always worth putting one on the Type 62 because it is a light tank and you do tend to get tracked quite a lot in this tank. Also, in a light tank, if you get tracked, you're going to die pretty soon afterwards, so a toolbox is not a bad choice to improve your repair speed on those tracks. However, filling your tanks with CO2 is not worth it. You've only got a 12% chance of fire, which surprisingly is very, very low considering this is a Chinese tank, and I really don't think it's worth filling your tanks with CO2 as a result. An enhanced gun laying drive I think is a waste of money on this tank. Again, if you're playing it as a fast mobile medium, you might want it, but 2.3 aim time on this tank is not bad, and you can get it down with things like vents and cruise skills anyway. So I really don't think an enhanced gun laying drive is worth it. Coated optics is definitely a viable choice. You have a view range of 390 meters on this tank. I chose not to go for coated optics because I tend to start games by passive scouting a lot in bushes. Therefore I went for binocs over the coated optics, but coated optics are a perfectly viable choice. You already have 390 meters of view range, and coated optics might actually be better. I'm looking at this now, and I'm actually playing around with the idea of taking off the Binox and putting coated optics on anyway. But yeah, definitely a viable choice if you're going to be playing this tank and keeping it on the move and basically using it as an active scout, which you can do. This tank traverses very quickly, it accelerates quickly, and it has a nice top speed. So whereas I tend to play it a little bit more passively and use Binox at the beginning of games, you can play it actively and you can go for coated optics. Lots and lots of viable choices. A gun rammer. Again, I've gone for a gun rammer because, again, I use Binox, I use this tank passively in the beginning of games, and I like having that extra DPM. This tank is very good DPM anyway, and I just like having 10% more. But you might even go for a camo net instead of a gun rammer, Binox and camo net, or maybe coated optics and Binox. It's completely up to you. That's just my choice. Torsion bars to improve the suspension and suspension durability. Again, a viable choice. If you're going to be using this thing as an active scout, you might want to go for enhanced suspension and coated optics over the choices I've gone. There are a lot of viable equipment choices depending on how you choose to play the tank. Wet ammo rack is... I think there are better equipment choices, but it's not a bad choice because of a problem I'm going to be talking about later in the review. The ammo rack on a Type 62 is at the back of the turret, so basically any shots in here are going to be hitting a Type 62's ammo rack, and that doesn't mean shots from the rear or shots from the side. Yes, shots towards the back of the turret and shots into the rear of the turret will hit the ammo rack, but unfortunately, because it's so lightly armored, shots through the front of the turret will actually go through the tank and will penetrate the ammo rack at the back as well. So even getting shot in the front is going to ammo rack you. So basically, wet ammo rack might not be a bad choice if you find yourself constantly being ammo racked, but it is completely up to you. Camo net I've already discussed. If you're going to be using this as a pure passive scout, maybe a bit like the 5916 at tier 6, then yep, camo net is another viable choice. Light spall liner is very, very cheap, but I don't think it's worth it. I really don't think it's worth putting on light tanks. And then we finally end up with improved vents, which I try to put on as many tanks as I want because I do want that extra view range. I do want that extra DPM. I want that 5% extra to everything. So it is there are a lot of viable equipment choices, and it is completely up to you. I'm just giving you my opinion on what I think would work and what wouldn't work on the tank. Okay guys, it is time for the overview game, a game where I show you as many strengths and weaknesses of whatever tank I'm reviewing in one replay. It just so happens that we've ended up in yet another tier 8 game. Now, watching this review and watching the clips I've chosen, I don't want you to get the impression that tier 8 games are common, because they're not. Most of the games I get in this tank are tier 10 or tier 9 games, but it has been a complete accident that the clips I have chosen or the games I chose all happen to be tier 8 games, and I didn't realize that till I sat down and started recording. But again, it just perhaps goes to show that this tank does really, really well when it gets into tier 8 games and doesn't do quite so well when it gets into tier 9 and 10 games. I'm not saying you can't have good games in higher tier matches, but it's just a heck of a lot more difficult, and I really don't have time to sit down and play more games in the Type 62 if I want to get this review out in time. So we're just gonna go. We're here on Erlenberg, and it is a 43%er, so I've got my work cut out for me. But we're going to be looking at the engine power to begin with, and I'm in a race. I'm in a race with an AMX 1375, another tier 7 light tank, and you can see how quick my acceleration is compared to his. I am way ahead of him, easily able to out-accelerate him, even though I've got a stock engine. I mean, having a stock engine on this tank really doesn't matter. This thing accelerates so quickly. So, I mean, we were doing 60 kilometers, over 60 kilometers most of the way here, and we've gotten into position very, very quickly. Now, my plan is to sit in E0, get some early spots, and maybe do some sniping. But AMX 1375 has a similar plan. He's moving up, and I'm starting to wonder who's going to be the one getting the spots. And I'll spoil the surprise, most of the spotting damage actually goes to me, so Tiger 2 has been spotted, and he's at the edge of my view range, so I know I can shoot his side, but now he's turning, and there's no way. You can see the orange reticule here. There's absolutely no way I'm going to go through a tier 8 heavy from the front. So side of a T-34, go for a blind shot. And these guys are just at the edge of my view range. You can see that 145mm of penetration, more than enough to go through an IS-3 at distance. T-34 is still advancing, he's still on full health, so I didn't hit him with my blind shot, but I do hit him that time. And you can see that the alpha damage is okay, the accuracy is good. I mistimed that shot. He started to turn just as I fired, so I ended up missing him. Go for a blind shot anyway. But all of these tanks are at the very edge of my view range, so I know that I probably have much better view range than they do. I'm probably undetected, but I decide to pull back just in case, and my team are hammering these tanks. So I'm getting a lot of spotting and damage done, I'm getting a lot of assistance damage done, and I'm playing like a scout. This is not a map that's covered in choke points like a lot of the more modern maps added to the game are. Erlenberg still has a place for some passive scouting. So I've sat there, not sure if I got the spot in the T-34 or if the AMX did, but there's no point in me firing. Very, very difficult for me to pen a T-34 from the front. So I'm trying to get shots at his machine gun port, but you can see I'm not penning. He's got a wreck in front of him. That shot goes a little bit high. So I decide I'm going to go for his track. I'm going to see if I can track him in place. Unfortunately, for once, the gun is letting me down. So I've got nothing else to shoot at. I know I've got very little chance of penning this guy, but I've got nothing else to shoot at this moment in time. So we managed to sneak a shot in through his commander's hatch, even though I was on an orange reticule. And we're going back to work on the front of his tank again. Trying to sneak a shot in, and we finally do. Finally pen him for kill number 1. So I notice our Centurion is being quite aggressive. I know that there's a T-28 prototype and a PZ-SFL-5 up here. And now it's time to make my move, so I'm going to be doing maybe a little bit more active spotting. A KV-1S has been spotted, a T-28 has been spotted. PZ-SFL has now been spotted, and he's reversed, he's gone back into cover, so I'm trying to get out of there before he puts shots into me. Trying to move erratically. And then I decide, okay, there are some wrecks up here maybe I can use, and yeah, RT gave me a little bit of a jump there, a little bit of a scare. Oh, and there's an RT. So this tank is fantastic at shooting on the move. There's a shot on the move. There's another shot on the move. The stats for shooting on the move when you're in a Type 62 are very, very good. So again, RT is raining all around me. There are 4 RT on the enemy team, and I've just spotted the M44. I figure I've dropped off radar by now. Get one shot in. He's blind. And someone else takes him out. The 1375 takes him out. Oh, how I wish I could have gotten that kill. But there are still, I've killed 1 RT. There's still 2 more RT in this game. PZ-SFL has decided to go drown himself. Yep. Rather than die, or go down fighting, he decides to suicide. Really, I think there should be an option to report players who do that. It's simply being a douchebag and denying another team or other players XP and credits. So there we go. Go for a ram. Decided to try and ram kill the M41. And as you can see, I decided to include this replay just to show you that this is a light tank. I was trying an epic ram kill on the M41 and didn't do a lot of damage to myself, but yeah, only managed to do 140 something damage with that ram. Ended up having to shoot him. So only 3 enemy tanks left, but you can get to see the speed, you get to see the maneuverability of this tank. And the gun is pretty good. It's a very light tank, so don't go try ramming anyone to death like I just did. So next RT is spotted. Get to his side, miss my shot on the move. That was probably more down to gun depression than actually a problem with the accuracy. But I take out RT number 3 for the final kill of the game. And that was another ace tanker in the Type 62. I also managed to pick up a Pascucci's medal. So I finished top on XP with 1388, did 2,222 damage, so quite a few of my blind shots actually did go in. Finished up with 4 kills, and as I say, killed 3 RT. Wish I could have killed the 4th one, but finished up with the Pascucci's medal. And as you can see, I spotted 8, damaged 8, destroyed 4, and got 2,249 assistance damage on top of the 2,200 damage I did myself. So the Type 62 is a very, very flexible tank. When the map allows you to, you can actually scout. It's a very, very good scout, either passive or active, but it can also damage deal. Don't let the 145mm of penetration on the gun put you off. The 145mm of penetration is only lacking when you're trying to shoot tanks frontally, as you saw when I was trying to pen the T-34. When you can shoot tanks in the side and rear, this gun is fantastic. And it's a moneymaker. I didn't have to fire any premium. Now, I could have switched to premium to penetrate the T-34 from the front, but I try to avoid premium whenever I can. So I earned 85,000 credits for that game, and yes, as long as you're not firing premium shots in this tank, it will make you money. Okay, folks, time to sum up. Is the Type 62 worth it? Well, it is a very, very competitive Tier 7 light tank, even though it's a premium. It really, really can compete against any of the other Tier 7 light tanks in the game. It has a lot of hit points. It's quite a light tank, and it has a fairly powerful engine. It accelerates really, really quickly, even though it's the stock 131 engine. It has a really, really high speed limit of 60 kilometers an hour. It can turn very, very fast, 54 degrees per second turning or traverse speed. It has amazing turret traverse speed. It can turn this turret and get its gun on target really, really quickly. As a scout, it has very good view range at 390, and that can be buffed up to well over that magical 450 meters. The signal range is a little bit of a letdown. It does only have 600 meters of signal range, but it's still not bad, but it is definitely a weak point for this tank. Another weak point is its gun depression. It only has 5 degrees of gun depression. A lot of the other Tier 7 light tanks have it beaten, but it has the same 5 degrees of gun depression that a WZ-131 has, because it's the same tank. So please forgive me if I'm about to have a little rant about the Type 62, or rather, not about the tank itself, but about the changes Wargaming have made to it. You see, the Type 62 is an amazing tank. It still is a great tank, and I really do think if you guys sit down and grind it out and get it for free on the September missions, you're going to enjoy this tank. It is really, really good. The problem is the Type 62 is not special anymore, and the reason for that is back when this tank was one of only 2 Chinese tanks available in the game, it was rare, it was exclusive, and it was fun to play, but Wargaming introduced Chinese tanks, and they did a very lazy cut and paste and basically turned the Type 62 into a WZ-131. And it's not a different tank, it's exactly the same tank. So basically, you don't need to get the Type 62 in order to enjoy driving it. You can buy the WZ-131, you can outfit it exactly like a Type 62 and have exactly the same experiences because it's exactly the same tank. So it's not quite as special anymore. But that's not the only reason why the tank isn't as fun as it used to be. The Type 62 used to be a Tier 6 light tank. Now, when Wargaming moved it to Tier 7, basically the claims and people were saying on the forums that it doesn't make any difference, it gets the same matchmaking. But that's not entirely true, because the tank has been moved to Tier 7. This tank used to be able to see a lot more Tier 6s, Tier 7s, Tier 8s, and Tier 9s, but now, because it's been moved to Tier 7, unfortunately, the tank mainly sees Tier 9s and 10s now. It occasionally gets into Tier 8 games, and in those games this tank can be an absolute beast, but the matchmaking is very, very tough. A lot tougher than it used to be on the Type 62. And that leads me on to the next little rant, which I've already covered in the video, is that the premium ammo is ridiculous. It's had 2 premium ammo nerfs. The penetration was nerfed from 250 on the premium ammo down to 220, and I don't mind that too much because 220 is still good. However, The matchmaking means that this tank sees tier 10s and tier 9s far more often, and it sees heavily armored tier 9s and heavily armored tier 10s far more often, and 145mm of penetration on the standard AP just doesn't cut it in those type of games. There are a lot of tier 9 and 10s that you can't penetrate from the side or from the rear with 145mm of penetration on the standard AP, and you do actually need to fire gold. And the price of the gold ammunition just does not make sense. I've already covered it, but the fact a tier 7 light tank costs as much for a gold shell as a tier 8 premium tank, and a lot of those tier 8 premium heavy tanks have better matchmaking than the Type 62 does. It just doesn't make sense. So if you do have to fire a lot of premium ammo in the Type 62, you're not going to make as much money. It is a money maker, but it all depends on the matchup and the tanks that are on the enemy team. So it's not as good a money maker as it used to be. But the biggest reason the Type 62 is not special anymore is because of this. Wargaming introduced a new tier 6 Chinese light tank, the Type 64, although technically it's Taiwanese, but I'm not going to get into politics. But this is the tier 6 Chinese light tank, and just like this Type 62, it is a very, very good crew trainer. In fact, it's got 5 crew slots compared to 4, and as you can see, the WZ-132 crew fit perfectly in here. You do need an extra radio operator, but as also mentioned in the video, the M5A1 Stuart does have a radio operator at tier 4, and if you've ground through the Chinese tanks, you already happen to have a spare light tank radio operator sitting in your barracks. So as a crew trainer, this thing is just as good. The other difference is the Type 64 is available from the tech tree, and the Type 64 is available from the gift shop. And it doesn't end there, because the Type 62 is very rare, it's very exclusive, and those times it does appear in the gift shop, it is usually part of a very, very expensive package. And the Type 64 is not expensive. The Type 64 costs a fraction of the price you're expected to pay for the Type 62. So if you're looking for a Chinese light tank crew trainer or premium light tank crew trainer, go for the Type 64. And the reason is, and we'll pop back into Tank Compare for this, the Type 64 is just as good as the Type 62 and better in some ways. We'll scroll down. They're both premium tanks, so we don't need to change their equipment, but we'll take a look at the tiers. The Type 64 is a tier lower, which makes it cheaper to buy, but it also gets better matchmaking. It's a tier 6 light tank that can see tier 7s, so the chances of getting this into a slightly lower tier game are a lot higher for the Type 64. The Type 62 has a lot more hit points, but then again, it's a tier lower, and 550 hit points is pretty much the standard for tier 6 light tanks. However, the Type 64 has better view range than the Type 62. It has a faster top speed, a much faster top speed, and the reverse speed is the same. Both tanks weigh about the same, have the same load limit, and are equally good crew trainers. Neither tank have particularly good armor, so really, even though the Type 62 is a little bit better on paper, it's not that much better, and any tank, or most tanks, are going to be able to pen you. The Type 64 has more engine power, it has more horsepower to weight ratio, and it has faster traverse speed, so the tank accelerates faster, it's got a faster top speed, and it turns faster than the Type 62 does. The terrain resistance is a little bit worse on the Type 64, but not by much. I notice absolutely no difference when I'm driving them. It does have a slightly higher chance of fire, but the view range is the same, and the turret traverse is slightly better on the Type 62, but 36 degrees per second is still pretty good on the Type 64. The Type 64 does have less alpha damage and less penetration with its AP ammo. However, the cost of its premium ammo is a lot less, and basically because it has a much faster rate of fire, much faster reload time, the DPM on the Type 64 is basically a lot better than it is on the Type 62, even though the Type 62 has very good DPM. Now, when we look at the penetration, I mentioned the penetration is not as good, but it's not that much better. 140 145mm of penetration on the Type 62 versus 128mm on the Type 64. However, you've got to be able to flank tanks, you'll be able to get shots into their sides and rear in the Type 62, and you need to be able to do that in the Type 64 as well. And basically, pretty much anything that the 145mm is going to go through from the side and rear, 128mm is also going to go through from the side and rear. So it has more DPM, it may have slightly less accuracy but not by much, and it has a faster aim time. The Type 64 also has better gun depression than the Type 62 with 7 degrees, and they both carry around the same amount of ammunition. So basically anything you can do in the Type 62, even though it's a really good tank, you can do equally as well in the Type 64. And as the Type 64 is a fraction of the price of the Type 62, I've really got to say, as much as I love this tank, it's not worth it. If you do have a Type 62, you probably like it. I love mine. If you're a tank collector, you're probably going to want to get the tank anyway. If you don't own a Type 62, then I think the Type 62 is worth grinding for the September missions. But should this tank appear in the gift shop in the future, it's probably going to be part of a very expensive package, and you'll be able to pick up a Type 64 for a fraction of the cost, and this tank is just as good as the Type 62 is. So as much as I love the Type 62, and the Type 62 is a really, really good Tier 7 Scout, I really do recommend it. Because of the introduction of the Type 64 for a fraction of the price of the Type 62, if you're not a tank collector, I'm going to say the Type 62 is not worth it. It may be worth the grind, you're not going to regret owning a Type 62, but as far as cost and gold goes, the Type 64 is far, far better value. And really, it's the Type 64 that has led me to this conclusion. This tank used to be special, it used to be amazing, and because of the introduction of the WZ-131 and the Type 64, it's just not as amazing as it used to be. That doesn't make it a bad tank, it's just not as good as it used to be, and if it does appear in the gift shop, it's probably not going to be worth it. Just go get yourself a Type 64 instead, and if you really do want to experience driving a Type 62, go grind out a WZ-131, and the two tanks are identical. It's the same tank. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.